So good evening, everyone. My name is Philip Osteen. I'm the new interim dean of the University of Utah College of Social Work. It really is my distinct honor to be here with you tonight and to welcome you to tonight's presentation, Wakanda Forever, Centering Black Experiences on Screen, with keynote speaker, Dr. Peniel Joseph, and an impressive group of national and local scholars and Marvel fans, including myself, knowledgeable on this engaging and important topic. Before we dive in to event introductions, on behalf of the College of Social Work, I'm honored to recognize the contributions of our American Indian community by acknowledging that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, the Paiute, the Goshute, and the Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the endearing relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationships between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So let me tell you a little bit about tonight's event, and I was very excited to get a history lesson as well. So this is the College of Social Work's revived Arthur L. Beeley Lecture, and it's honoring the founding dean of the college, Arthur Beeley. After observing the onslaught of social issues brought on by the Great Depression in the 1930s, Dr. Beeley, a sociology and anthropology professor here at the university, understood the dire need for a professional workforce equipped to tackle the challenges communities were facing. Inspired by the need for change, Dr. Beeley sought help from the university and established the Graduate School of Social Work in 1937, serving as its dean for over 20 years. The school established the Arthur L. Beeley Lectures in 1961, which welcomed notable experts in the field to address current matters of concern. Today, during a time when many social issues and injustices are exacerbated by the pandemic, we are really pleased and honored to reestablish the Arthur L. Beeley Lecture tradition with a look at the representation of Black stories and experiences through Marvel's comic books and blockbuster movies. I'd like to also offer special thanks to College of Social Work alum, Charles S. Pohl, who allows us to explore this important topic through his generous sponsorship of the 2022 Beeley Lecture. Charlie, a lifelong fan of comics, has enjoyed reading what he calls classic comics, comic book adaptations of classical literature, but still throughout his adulthood recognizes Donald Duck and Bugs Bunny as his favorite childhood comic book characters. Finally, I'm delighted and honored to introduce the University of Utah Interim Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and former Dean of the College of Social Work, Dr. Martel Teasley, who will share a bit about the inspiration for tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Osteen. As mentioned, I'm Martel Teasley, the Interim Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at the fabulous University of Utah. And I'm excited to be involved in the return of the Beeley Lecture Series and grateful to all who've joined us tonight to make this particular event possible. This presentation explores recent efforts to center the Black perspective, share more authentic stories, and address racism specifically through television and film adaptation of the comic books many of us read as children, and as I must confess, into adulthood. In a fitting tribute to and celebration of Black History Month, our nationally renowned presenter, Dr. Joseph, will explore the evolution of these stories from paper to screen and consider the successes and failures in representing the Black experience, as well as offer guidance for the future of storytelling. I am honored to introduce two of the social justice heroes in today's events, our presenters and our moderator. Our presenter this evening, Dr. Peniel Joseph, is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethnic and Political Values at the LBJ School of Political Affairs and professor of history and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Joseph's career has focused on Black Power studies, an interdisciplinary topic that explores Africana studies, law and society, women and ethnic studies, and political science. He has authored several books on African-American history, including the latest, The Sword and the Shield, which you can order from the U's campus store through the link in the chat. Following Dr. Joseph's presentation, we'll hand the time over to our esteemed moderator, Elijah Garfield. Mr. Garfield, a self-proclaimed geek and a collector of comic book memorabilia, serves as the director of the Black Cultural Center here at the U. He will lead a discussion, at which point we will introduce our other lead characters this evening, and we'll invite questions from the audience. Now I am thrilled to welcome our presenter to the virtual stage. Dr. Joseph, please take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Teasley, Dean Austin, and everyone who, Elijah, Dr. Griffin, Dr. Lawrence, everyone who helped organize this. So thank you so much. It's an honor. I'll start by way of introduction. My name is Peniel Joseph, and I'm a native New Yorker. I'm a Generation Xer. I grew up in Brooklyn and Southside Jamaica, Queens, and I grew up loving and reading about comic books, but also loving and reading about and experiencing popular culture. The late, great Sidney Poitier, for example, is somebody I grew up watching movies of Sidney Poitier, not just To Sir with Love and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and Lilies of the Field, but really The Blackboard Jungle, 1955, and No Way Out, his first role in 1950. I grew up loving Sidney Poitier because of the strong and A Raisin in the Sun with Ruby Dee in 1961. So I grew up loving Sidney Poitier because of the real strong, complex characterization that he played of the Black experience. He was from the Caribbean, he's from the Bahamas, but he was a real pivotal example of sort of this Pan-African Blackness, which we're going to talk about today. And this idea of Wakanda Forever, I want to place this in its proper historical context because I'm a historian. And the reason why narratives matter and narrative power matters so much is because narratives really impact the way in which we all live. When we think about narratives in American history, right now we are, I've argued, experiencing America's third Reconstruction from 2008 to the present. And this is important because the first Reconstruction, popularly theorized as 1865 to 1877, really is a 3-decade-long effort to construct a new birth of American freedom from 1865 up until the Wilmington Massacre in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. The second Reconstruction is really what we think of as the modern civil rights movement. I would periodize the high point of that movement as 1954 to 1968, the Brown decision, all the way up until the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On April 4th, 1968, Thursday. But that second Reconstruction really lasts 3 decades, from about the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, when we think about the transformations and second wave Black feminism and labor movements and the Black arts movement and civil rights and Black power movements. I argue that this period is a period of a third Reconstruction that's really been punctuated by the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the rise of the Tea Party and the birther movement, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement 1.0 in 2013, the rise of Trump and MAGA America, and then of course in 2020, the rise of Black Lives Matter 2.0, the pandemic and its disproportionately racist impact on Black communities, and of course, BLM 2.0, and of course, January 6th, and the riot that occurred at the US Capitol. And what ties and tethers together these 3 periods of Reconstruction, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, is narratives and stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I'm saying this as Americans, but also as Black Americans, as white Americans, as Asian American and Pacific Islanders, as Latinx, as Indigenous folks, whoever we are, the story we tell about ourselves. And when we think about those narratives, those narratives have been conceptualized within the framing of American exceptionalism, right? And when we think about that idea of American exceptionalism, it's a very powerful idea, and it can also be a very dangerous idea, because it's this idea that things that have been broken in the context of the creation of American democracy can be fixed, but more often than not, they're dismissed. So we don't want to talk about settler colonialism. We don't want to talk about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. We don't want to talk about anti-Black racism. We don't want to talk about the violence of colonialism, both externally, but also the violence of colonialism and imperialism domestically. So we tell ourselves these stories that become myths, whether they're true or not. One of the biggest myths is the story of the lost cause, right? And the lost cause is very, very important, because we're still battling this idea, this debate between supporters of multiracial democracy who are Reconstructionists going back over 150 years ago, and advocates of white supremacy who are redemptionists. The Redeemer South became the whole entire nation through the institutionalization of Jim Crow, segregation, and violence in the United States of America. So I want to preface my comments there, because narratives have power. The stories we tell ourselves, right? The symbols that we valorize, whether they're going to be symbols of abolition and what Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells envisioned as a multiracial democracy, or symbols of racial terror and violence, right? Those stories we tell ourselves actually inform public policy. They inform religion. They inform fiction and nonfiction. They inform the law. They inform the neighborhoods we all live in. They inform our access to healthcare, both mental and physical healthcare. They inform education and education access and equity, or education disparities and segregation. They inform opportunities at wealth building and wealth accumulation. They inform land distribution and redistribution, right? So these stories matter. The reason why nationally we are in a debate over critical race theory, we are in debates over voting rights. These are debates about the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell our children to animate our reality. And I would argue that one of the most powerful stories in the post-war era is comic books. Comic books. And this is where it's really, really interesting, because when we think about this idea of Black or racial representation in comic books, there's a real story and a journey that comic books take. When I was reading comic books in high school over 30 years ago, comic books, when it came to representation, there wasn't a lot of Black representation. You did have the Falcon, you did have Black Panther, you did have Luke Cage. There's a point in the 1980s where Captain Marvel became a Black woman, and we were all very, very excited that she was a Black woman, complete with an afro, right? It was very, very exciting. From time to time, you had a person of color who was an Avenger. You had a person of color in the DC universe who was maybe a little bit slightly more than a sidekick, but in a lot of ways, pop culture through comic books, both DC and Marvel, really reified and reinforced the existing racial status quo. Of course, the Black Panther, which is introduced in 1966, is a very transgressive comic. When we think about the X-Men and the New Mutants, at times there were Black mutants, which was very, very positive. But when we think about the comic book adaptations, right, which really, start as early as the 1930s and 40s through serials, Black and white serials of everything from The Flash to Superman to Bob Kane's Batman, and others, there's really not a lot of racial diversity in there. There's not really a lot of Black representation. When we think about racial representation, 1966 to 1968, Batman is on NBC and for one season on ABC, and that's a big hit for a time. And one of the things that breaks the mold is Eartha Kitt. And Eartha Kitt plays the first really positive Black comic book representation in popular culture vis-a-vis sort of television or film in 1966, 67, 68. And Eartha Kitt takes over, it's Eartha Kitt and Julie Newmar who are playing it. And it's very interesting because in the context, you think about color blindness, and we can critique color blindness in terms of colorblind racism, but they, in the context of the Batman, it's very interesting. They don't say anything about the Black woman, about the Catwoman being Black, right? It's sort of, she's just there, right? And it's very, very interesting that occurs. And Eartha Kitt's Catwoman actually predates Diane when we think about Julia, right? It predates, because Julia is on Diane Carroll's Julia, 1968 to 1971. And of course, Sidney Poitier and Diane Carroll at one point had a relationship. They're one of the first sort of Black star couples in American history, power couples, alongside of people like Cicely Tyson and Miles Davis, right? And so when we think about these depictions, at times they're positive, but when we think about by 1967 and the Green Hornet and Bruce Lee as Kato, they really go into stereotypes, right? Bruce Lee is the sidekick, when we know Bruce Lee is this massive, iconic star who was just playing the sidekick to the Green Hornet for this one season show. And then when we think about comic book adaptations in the 1970s and 80s, in a lot of ways, Black folks are missing in action really until Blade in 1998, 1999. So the comic book adaptations, we're thinking about The Incredible Hulk, we're thinking about Captain America, 2 television pilots, we're thinking about The Amazing Spider-Man, and I'm thinking about the Nicholas Hammond Spider-Man that starts in 1977, and not the Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield or this latest Tom Holland Spider-Man, right? And so in a lot of ways, Black folks are missing in action, right? Sometimes maybe Bill Bixby's The Incredible Hulk runs into a Black person to prove we're alive, right? But we're really not part and parcel of that universe, right? So in a way, what's really important about the Marvel universe and its cinematic depiction is Blade. Blade really, the triptych with Wesley Snipes shows a Black character who had really been a Marvel B character, Blade as the Black vampire hunter. This was not the A-list of the Black Panther. And really Wesley Snipes it turns in a bravura performance as that vampire hunter. And in a lot of ways that breaks open different areas of depiction for African Americans. But when we think about the Marvel universe that starts with 2008's Iron Man, it is really something that it takes a full decade for a Black character to receive their own film, right? And it takes a decade of pressuring Marvel, right? We got 3 Iron Mans, multiple Thors, multiple Avengers, right? And other characters, Ant-Man and others, before the depiction of T'Challa as in the Black Panther. Of course, T'Challa is debuts in Captain America: Civil War, right? And that's a great, fantastic debut. But even until we have the great director Ryan Coogler, who really does fantastic world building, and I want to talk about sort of what that means and why, you know, the $1.3 billion, but what did that mean for the African American community, including myself, who saw that movie multiple times and brought people to that movie in February of 2018. And one thing I'll ask the panelists, do we think that they released it during Black History Month on purpose? Right, to get that little weekend bump. They said, we know one group of people were going to see it, and then was really surprised by the overrepresentation from other groups across the board, right, to make it one of Marvel's biggest hits. But for a moment, I want to talk about the Black Panther movie and why that was so important. And we really, the title of this talk is Wakanda Forever. Black Panther is an extraordinary film for a number of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that it takes you into a comic book world without having to have a white guide to that world. It's an entire Black world with a Black point of view, a Black perspective. And even though there's a white agent there who's part of SHIELD, he's really a secondary or tertiary character. Everyone is forced to come into the world of Wakanda and sort of embrace that world, right? We use the term Afrofuturism, and we could think about Octavia Butler, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in Q&A. I think of Afrofuturism as even predating Octavia Butler. I think about people like Ida B. Wells. I think about Mariah Stewart, certainly a Black feminist tradition that calls us into the future, certainly Du Bois, certainly Frederick Douglass. So in a lot of ways, Afrofuturism is not just sci-fi, it's this ability to, even while facing racial discrimination, at times racial terror, to think optimistically about a world where Black dignity and Black citizenship is normal, right? That in a lot of ways to me is Afrofuturism. Now there's people who've added to that, and over the years, set up, again, we think about Parable of the Sower, and we set up and Demon Seed, and we set up different sort of science fiction angles. But I think when you think about Afrofuturism, what's extraordinary about Black Panther is the way in which it's connected to a Pan-African international future. So in a lot of ways, I think of Malcolm X as an Afrofuturist, Martin Luther King Jr. in his own way as an Afrofuturist, certainly people like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, because they are envisioning a world that is not yet created, okay? So I think about Afrofuturism as looking backwards to look forward. And one example I'll give you is Angela Davis. Angela Davis writes the most, and I write about this in my new book, but one of the most important essays in American history is the essay she writes about Black women and racial slavery while she's in prison facing the gas chamber in 1971, right? And she's not acquitted of all charges until the summer of 1972. But in that essay, she really theorizes about Black women's dignity and citizenship in the 19th century, and how that dignity and citizenship is key to a future liberation practice by all Black people, right? And so it's a really extraordinary essay. She talks, and in a way, before Robin Kelly's Race Rebels, she talks about Black women and the work stoppages and the acts of theft and discontent, and really the rebellion and the revolutionary nature of their struggle. And she pushes back against the Moynihan thesis. She pushes back against ideas of Black matriarchy, upsetting and marginalizing what Daniel Patrick Moynihan said was the need for Black patriarchy, right? So when we think about Afrofuturism, it also problematizes the idea of patriarchy. It problematizes capitalism. It problematizes heteronormativity. It problematizes toxic masculinity and the marginalization of the spirits of Black women and men and others within our community. So it's very, very important. When we think about the Black Panther movie, and just sort of to take us to why that is so important, I love the characters of Eric Killmonger and T'Challa there. Eric Killmonger provides a critique of white supremacy, a critique of colonialism and imperialism, a critique of mass incarceration, and a critique of the inability at times for Black people globally to really live in solidarity with their shared experience of struggle, right? And then we'll talk about how T'Challa challenges some of those views too, right? But I think the Killmonger character is really key there, because in a lot of ways, Killmonger and T'Challa in that movie are sort of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and trying to figure out how to construct a liberation theory and a liberation practice for all people. In the context of T'Challa, I think like King, he's interested in this idea of citizenship, but it's a constrained citizenship for the denizens and the residents of Wakanda, right? And in the terms of Killmonger, I think he's very much like Malcolm X, who's interested in what I've called radical Black dignity, right? And that notion of radical Black dignity is really important, because it's not just this idea of Black people loving themselves, although it is that. It's really an idea of Black humanity being recognized first and foremost by Black people, and not necessarily looking for external validation of that recognition, right? It's very, very interesting. Malcolm says that dignity is going to be the end of world white supremacy, but at the same time, he criticizes King for what he feels is sort of going hat in hand to have Black citizenship recognized. I think when you see Killmonger and T'Challa, King T'Challa, and Eric Killmonger, it's very interesting, that push-pull of dignity and citizenship, and this idea that Black people either require recognition on the one hand, or actually can find liberation in the last place they ever expected to look, which is within themselves, right? It's very, very interesting. So Killmonger is this politics of self-determination, right? And T'Challa is this politics of really isolationism up until the end. By the end of that movie, he takes a journey, right? He takes a journey. I think that some people have looked at Eric Killmonger as an anti-hero, because he's talking about, he's so angry, he's just gonna sort of, wipe out those who've been colonialists and imperialists. And in doing so, he sort of becomes that which he critiques, right? But I think it's more complicated than that. I think that Killmonger, who by the end of that movie, of course, it's as he's dying, talks about how his father, who's played brilliantly by Sterling Brown of This Is Us, how his father told him how beautiful Wakanda was, right? And he there's a point where T'Challa tells him, who's played by, of course, the late great Chadwick Boseman, tells him that we can still heal you. And he says, no, he says, I don't want to be healed. Why? So you can put me in a cage, right? And I think that there's something very, very crucial about that, because that is about the existential crisis of being Black in an anti-Black context, right? So even in Wakanda, he's fearful that he's going to be caged up, right? Even as I think actually the Killmonger character is undergoing a process of transformation, right? I think he's undergoing a process of transformation, but he's concerned about his own liberty because the world he comes from is hell-bent on locking up people who look like him, right? And he also, in that final scene of Killmonger, talks about his ancestors and his ancestors who jumped from slave ships. And the quote that Killmonger says, which is unforgettable, is they knew that death was better than bondage, right? And that's very, very poignant and profound. But at the same time, it can be hyperbolic, because most people didn't jump off the ships, right? People were pragmatic and wanted to survive and hope that in survival, they could bequeath future generations a context where they could thrive in. And that's where I think T'Challa comes in, right? So I think what's interesting about Wakanda is that the world of Wakanda and the Black Panther movie is that it really bridges together the African-American experience, the African experience, and the diasporic experience all together, right? And it locates home both in Oakland, California, but also in Africa, right? At the same time, simultaneously. So when we think about those representations, I think those representations are unbelievably positive. We could talk in the Q&A, what are the constraints of this? This is produced by Disney. this is global capitalism. I get it. I completely get it. But remember, we as Black people are capitalists as well. And I'm not talking about people who might say, oh no, I'm socialist, I'm a humanist. We live in a capitalist global context, okay? So we're all capitalists. We're all capitalists. We're all trying to survive and thrive. We might be saying, hey, we have a critique of it. We want to transform it. We want redistributive justice. We want all these things, the abolition of punishment and prisons, all those things. But I think it's important for us to remember that we still are in this society, even if we're trying to think of a future that's going to be much, much more fundamentally different. Now, I want to continue with Black Panther, but then I want to sort of wrap up so we can get into our dialogue. I think post Black Panther, and here I'm getting away from Marvel films, I'm thinking about Watchmen. Regina King in Watchmen and Yaba Blay. This is really, really unbelievable stuff. And the fact that Cord Jefferson won an Emmy, the first Black man to win an Emmy for writing an episode of Prime Time, and the way in which they set up Watchmen as a world wherein superheroes exist, but so does racism, so does queerphobia, so does inequality, right? And that the first superhero is this former Black police officer, right? It's an extraordinary elevation of the art form through representation. One of the things that we are in this battle with, this struggle, right, is this idea that the myth is better than our reality, right? You know, the old saying, when it comes to fact versus legend, print the legend, right? Not the fact, right? But when we think about it, the story of America, the actual story, the good, the bad, the ugly, the grandeur and the travails, is much better than the mythologies we tell ourselves about our history, right? And so I think Watchmen and Lovecraft Country are really, really brilliant examples of this, where there's what Derek Bell called racial realism. And yes, Derek Bell was a critical race theorist, right? What he called racial realism, and what Bell called racial realism was this idea of just understanding and recognizing the reality of structures of oppression and racism, but trying to challenge those structures and push beyond those structures, right? So it wasn't defeatist. And when we think about Watchmen and Lovecraft Country, this is popular culture set in the here and now, even as what Lovecraft Country does is really do this very interesting sci-fi mashup with an understanding that Jim Crow racism exists in that world. And what does it mean where you have Black characters who have superpowers and magical powers, but there's also racism? What does it mean, right? I think it so enriches the story beyond what you see when you even see great films like Blade Runner, right? I loved Lovecraft Country, loved Watchmen, right? And it's the very fact that the verisimilitude comes from the fact that they don't shy away from racial injustice, and they don't shy away from our history. It's American history. So I think they teach us, and this goes back to Sidney Poitier, that we don't have to be ashamed of American history. It doesn't mean there's no shameful aspects, but teaching our children this history doesn't mean it's this mark of shame. We should be proud of those who have fought to transform this country into a multiracial democracy, where we have taken a wrong turn, right? And remember, Dr. King said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Where we've gone away from that is when we validate those who were redemptionists, both in the past and contemporary redemptionists, those who are interested in white supremacy and racial injustice forever, in perpetuity, right? So the generations who were abolitionists, we don't have controversies over statues and symbols of white abolitionists and Black abolitionists, right? What we haven't done as a nation is exalt those abolitionists. There are white folks who died on behalf of racial justice throughout our history, but what we do is we don't talk about them, and we don't talk about Thaddeus Stevens. We don't talk about Charles Sumner. We don't talk about Viola Liuzzo. We don't talk about Jonathan Daniels. We don't talk about the men and women who went to Freedom Summer, right, and put their lives on the line. We don't talk about Andrew Goodman and obviously James Chaney, but Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner were white, Jewish. We don't talk about them. Where are the statues for them, right? And so when we think about that popular culture and that narrative war, it's important that what I think Black Panther, Watchmen, and Lovecraft Country, and we could talk about others, what they do is really, they tweak our standard origin story. They push beyond the boundaries of American exceptionalism. And remember, one of the weaknesses of American exceptionalism is that it's based on a couple of lies. You know, the first lie is that Black people were not human beings, which justified racial slavery. The second lie is that the first lie never happened, right? And that's how we teach our history, and we all go on about our business, to the extent that, and that lie is so pervasive, when you start talking about institutional racism, like Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton in 1967, structural racism, you have whole groups of people who say, well, what are you talking about, right? The reason why is because American exceptionalism, what's caked into American exceptionalism is both redemptionist and reconstructionist impulses. The only reason the reconstructionist impulses are baked into it is because of the second Reconstruction and what we get with Brown, the Voting Rights, the Civil Rights Act. And remember, that period and the consequences in certain ways end after 2013, right after the re-election of the first Black president, because of Shelby v. Holder and the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act. So we have to remember, when we think about 1965 to 2013, there's an uneasy racial consensus in the United States. All the presidents from 65 to 2013 support the Voting Rights Act, including Nixon and Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. This consensus, it's a fragile consensus, but that's what produces Barack Obama, but it also produces the Black Lives Matter movement and the necessity for the Black Lives Matter movement. It also produces Charlottesville and January 6th. So I'll wrap up by saying, what's so, and again, right now, I think all the scholars who are students of Black history know that people are talking about Afro-pessimism, sort of racial versus racial optimism, right? And Frank Wilkerson has the third has a great book, Afro-pessimism, but people can talk about Derek Bell. You can talk about aspects of a lot of people's work in terms of Afro-pessimism. And when we think about Afro-pessimism versus racial optimism, we can just, in a very simple, maybe even vulgar way, Afro-pessimism in a simple way is just making the claim that racism is not only a constitutive element of American democracy, it's never going to be undone. Right. And sort of how do you strategize within that reality? And you can argue in again, equally simplistic way, what racial optimism argues is that it can be overcome. Right. And I think racial optimists have multiple camps. Some are also racial realists, and they'll tell you it's going to take generations. Others are more interested in symbolism. And so as long as there's enough Black folks, Black faces in higher places, they're good, right? They're like, hey, things are getting better, right? But I think what's important for us in terms of that racial realism versus Afro-pessimism is the way in which the representation of both in popular culture is necessary. Both are necessary. And I think at its best, when we've seen Marvel is really good at the racial optimism, not necessarily as good as the Afro-pessimism, although the Eric Killmonger character is absolutely a brilliant example of that, although obviously he's killed. So we don't necessarily need people who are part of the Black radical tradition. At least on that end, they have to be killed, in their popular representation. But I think it's important that he existed. And then finally, when we think about right now where we're at as a country, as a nation, and I argued at the first outset that this is America's third Reconstruction, there really is this existential crisis, and there's this existential narrative war between Reconstructionist supporters of multiracial democracy and redemptionist advocates of white supremacy. And that continues. And I think comic books are part of that terrain. Popular culture, music, policy, parent-teacher associations and school boards are all part of that terrain, because the stories we tell about our history, the stories we tell about the environment and racial justice, the story we tell about mental health, the stories we tell about access and equity and equality. Higher education is really, really a big part of this. How can we leverage higher education either in support of Reconstructionist impulses or in support of redemptionist impulses, right? And so those stories we tell matter, and that's why this matters. These are not just stories. We are like every single society. It's not just us, it's the Romans, it's the Greeks, it's all societies. What animated the society is the story that the society told about itself, okay? That's why it's so important. It's the books we write, it's the podcasts we listen to. Yes, I'm talking to you, Joe Rogan. It's the podcasts we listen to. All of it matters, right? We manifest it. We manifest it. So when we say in the past, even if people were upset during that period of racial consensus, doesn't mean that racism didn't exist. But look, during that period, we got the most Black elected officials in history. We got the most Black women and men elected in American history. We got 2 terms of a Black president, right? So it was much better during a time period where presidents said, even if it was just pro forma, that they believed in racial justice. Because look, we just went through 4 years of the exact opposite. And we saw what telling a different story about American society and American democracy. We saw the furies that it animated in Charlottesville, at the nation's capital, right? So stories matter. So never think to yourself that, oh my gosh, if a school is saying they're interested in diversity, equity, it doesn't matter. It actually matters. Should we hold them accountable? Absolutely. But the story matters. If we say, guess what? We don't want equity and we don't want justice. Our students, our faculty, our community are going to take all that in, and they're going to tell themselves a different story, right? And it's gonna be a story that reaps bitter fruit, a bitter harvest, right? So we have to remember that these stories matter. And so that's why I'm so profoundly interested in stories of Black representation that also cast a very, very specific, clear-eyed view of our history of racism, racial injustice, but also our history of challenging racism, of challenging injustice, and really trying to build that beloved community that Dr. King spoke of so movingly during his lifetime. That's it. Thank you.
Oh my, oh my. I was taking notes. I was like, oh my, okay. This is great. Thank you, Dr. Joseph, so much for your insightful presentation on this important topic. It really put my excitement in me, because I'm just like, dang, can I study this as a PhD? Can I?
No, absolutely you can. No, this
I'm like,
absolutely.
I was
there
like,
are folks doing wonderful work on race and comic books and Blackness and comic books. So yes, you can absolutely study. And one thing, Elijah, I didn't talk about the Black Captain America, and I'd love to talk about that in the Q&A, because that's certainly coming out of a graphic novel from really 30 years ago. And the way in which Carl Lumley plays the Black Captain America is so beautiful. And I thought Anthony Mackie was brilliant. And I think it's important for us to understand the artistic merit of Captain America and the Falcon, and the Falcon becoming or the Falcon and Winter Soldier and the Falcon becoming the new Captain America, but also that critics have deemed that like the worst one out of all those Disney ones. And most of these critics are white. And as soon as you talk about racism, they move on. So we have to understand that when you deal with Black people and our experiences artistically, we need much more representation at the Oscars, at the Emmys, in newspapers, in blogs, so you can have a much more honest accounting of this artistry, you know. And it's the same thing that happened with one of the with Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad, brilliant on Amazon. Barry Jenkins, it's a masterpiece. Many people didn't see it because even some Black people thought it was too hard to watch. I read Colson Whitehead's Pulitzer Prize winning novel. I saw all 10 episodes. It is absolutely brilliant, completely shut out, didn't win Emmys, didn't, you know, all this stuff. So we have to understand it's not just about representation and being able to produce it like we did with the Falcon and Winter Soldier. We have to also show up for these things artistically. Black folks as an audience, Black people who are non-Black and in solidarity with this idea of multiracial democracy. So it's really important because I really thought that out of all these Marvel series on Disney, the Falcon and Winter Soldier was clearly the best one. Clearly. I mean, Loki, what? You know, ridiculous, right? and clearly the best one, but guess what? It's a Black lead, right?
Yeah.
And so you've got folks online, trolls, and it's just racism, and doubling down on the racism, right? Yeah. And so it's important for us to really speak truth to power about that. I wrote something for CNN about how a Black Captain America changes everything. And I really stand, you know, in real direct solidarity with Carl Lumbly, who folks like me who are old enough, we remember Carl Lumbly, they had him playing, you know, violent people on Law and Order in the 1980s. This brilliant Black, you know, sort of Shakespearean trained actor, you know, like, and he finally got a role like at 65, 66. And where's Carl's Emmy? You know, he's completely brilliant in that, right? And so is Anthony Mackie. So it's important for us to really, those of us who are scholars, intellectuals, you know, thought leaders, to you know, show that, teach that to our classes, right? They're much more comfortable watching us in The Wire than Captain America, right? You know,
which The Wire is a good show.
Right? We're all from Baltimore. We didn't, you know, I said at the start that I grew up in New York. No, I'm from Baltimore too. We're all from Baltimore, just the hood, right? We didn't grow up in the South. There's no Black people in Utah. We're just from Baltimore. The Wire. That's our birth. That's our origin story. Ridiculous.
Yes. No, thank you. Yes, absolutely. And I'm like, yes, even though the Wire is one of my favorite shows of all time.
Oh, no, of course.
But,
yes, of course. But I'm saying it's like, it's not all we do, right?
Yes,
we do all of it. It's not all we do.
Yes. Great point. And so with that, I would like to also bring in, we have several panelists here to kind of have a conversation with you, Dr. Joseph. And first, I would like to, as we introduce these panelists, really also as you introduce yourselves, tell me what's your favorite comic book character. So first, I want to start with Dr. Rachel Griffin, Associate Professor of the University of Utah's Department of Communication. Dr. Griffin, can you please tell us, or just take a brief moment to kind of introduce yourself, and what is your favorite comic book character?
First, thank you, Malijah. Second, thank you, Dr. Joseph. I'm going to say some things about some things that you said, but before I say any things, I'm just going to say I'm a tenured professor over in communication, specifically in race and communication. I'm also a Black feminist and a critical race theorist and scholar activist. Malijah, I am teaching a critical race theory class right now. I do not understand why you're not in it if you want to go and earn graduate degrees and such. So you let me know if I can help you on that front, and I will. But my favorite character out of the Marvel universe, it actually dates back to my childhood. So I am biracial, Black and white. My mother is my white parent and my father was my Black parent. And my mom, you know, who had me at 18, my naive white teenage mother, she taught me a lot of lessons through Spider-Man, and the idea that with great power comes great responsibility. My mother has been quoting that, and she actually, I just quoted the contemporary version. My mother quotes the version coming out of the comic books in the 1960s that she read, you know, as the youngest of 6 kids as a kid. And so Spidey is still how I roll, but not new school Spidey. I'm talking old school Spidey.
Yes, I love that. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Griffin, as well as our next panelist we have here is Dr. Novotny Lawrence, associate professor at the Iowa State University Green-Lee School of Journalism and Communication. Dr. Lawrence, could you please also introduce yourself, and what is your favorite comic book character?
Sure. Thank you, Malijah. I appreciate it. And thank you, Dr. Joseph. I appreciate you as well. Very insightful. I'm an associate professor in the Green-Lee School of Journalism and Communication. And my areas of emphasis are film, race, media, and popular culture. My favorite Marvel character actually is the Netflix version of Luke Cage.
That especially that first season, Dr. Lawrence. That first season was
fantastic. I don't need the stuff with the Defenders, that brother survives the prison industrial complex, dons a hoodie, and fights against social injustices.
That was great. Luke Cage was great.
And so I think for me, and in the moment it came out, that's my that's who I got to roll with. I do have to ask you all, and Dr. Griffin, because you mentioned Spider-Man. Anybody remember watching Spider-Man on Electric Company? Did anybody ever get that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I just had to ask.
Dr. Lawrence, I'm not old enough for that.
I am. So the Spider-Man there was the 1960s. I got one even better. So there was the 1960s cartoon, but do you all remember the Marvel cartoons that had the songs like for Incredible Hulk? It was like Doc Bruce Banner doesn't like gamma rays, turns into the Hulk, ain't he young? Remember? And Tony Stark makes you feel he's cool with a heart of steel. Remember? Amazing armor, it's Iron Man.
I do remember that. Although you seem to remember it very well, Dr. Joseph.
Those were indelible. I would have, when I was younger, I would have thought I'd been like Dr. Lawrence, where it just been a film scholar of film and journalism, and it's my mom who got me into the politics and history, and sort of she subverted some of that into. So I write about that, but now, because I do so many op-eds, I've written like hundreds of op-eds, I'm able to sort of satisfy that. But I still, there's a book I'm going to do that's on, I remember Harry Belafonte in The World, the Flesh and the Devil, so it's very, it's very meaningful in that sense. But yeah, the Spider-Man, you're right. The Electric Company was a big one.
That the students attending are like, what are these old Black people talking about? Like, what is happening?
Do people remember the Doctor Strange pilot with Peter Wooten? That wasn't by CBS, 1978.
Our students are still like,
Doctor Strange pilot.
The Cosby Show is that show that was on when my parents were kids. Like they ain't going back that far. Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
We being a bunch of old Black people right now.
Yes, absolutely. And then lastly, we also have our last panelist, but not least, Dr. Paul White, which is an associate professor here at the University of Utah in psychology. Dr. White, take us home. What is your favorite comic book character, and just a little background about yourself?
Okay, well, the background, I really enjoyed your talk, Dr. Joseph, and you'll see, because you're talking to someone I was born in '66, not long after, just a few months after Black Panther was debuted.
Yep.
Eartha Kitt is still my Catwoman.
Oh, yeah.
All these years. I was born in Langston, Oklahoma, so Langston University, historical Black college, but then moved to southeastern Kentucky, so in the Appalachian Hills with all white people. And you'll see, so I don't have if I had to pick, I do have a favorite character, and it is Spider-Man, but it's it's really, and it's old school Spider-Man, but it's also, you know, so Peter Parker, but it's also Miles Morales.
Yeah.
And when Ultimate came out and they did, you know, that Spider-Man, but I also like from the movies, it's Peter Parker. I like the way Tom Holland played him, but Okoye, the scene, I still think the scene in Black Panther when she throws the spear and the car hits it and they do that close up on her and she's just got that smile on her face.
Yeah.
That's what I want is my inner self.
Yeah.
Like,
No, it's brilliant.
Yes.
I like Captain America. I actually do like the Steve Rogers Captain America and love the way they did with Falcon and Winter Soldier.
Yeah.
The way they characterize that. Because one of the things I thought about when you were saying, talk about the Afro pessimism, I thought about Isaiah Bradley.
Yeah.
And in particular, the scene where he, when he goes at the end and his grandson is chiding Sam Wilson and he goes, you know, the whole, what do you want, Black Falcon? And he goes, oh, he's not a Falcon, but he's still black. And I just thought, yep, it's just that kind of grind. It still reminds me.
When Isaiah Bradley tells him at one point, no self-respecting Black man would wear that uniform, would be Captain America, right? And so, you know, I thought there's a great new book by one of my colleagues who's at GW, Tom Guglielmo, called Divisions, which is sort of a definitive history of race and racism during World War II in the military, Black folks in the military. But he looks at Asian, Japanese, Latino folks too. But it's such a searing experience what our folks went through in the military. And to see Isaiah Bradley, who was the first super soldier. And again, I always thought that made sense comic book wise in reality, because they would test it on a Black man first, not on Steve Rogers. You know what I mean? You know, like like who's going to be the guinea pig? They're not picking, you know, so it's very much true to form. And, you know, I always thought that it was so great to see Isaiah Bradley and the hurt and the vulnerability, because it's not bitterness when all this injustice has occurred to you, you know, and you're acknowledging that. And you're acknowledging the hypocrisy. That's not bitterness. That's just speaking truth to power. That's not bitterness. So I don't ever think of Dr. King or Malcolm or Angela Davis or Ella Baker or Fannie Lou Hamer as bitter. You know, I think of them as people who are truth tellers, but certainly telling the truth here stokes a lot of violence that's already here, right? It stokes a lot of violence that's already here. And I think a lot of times, and we're caught up, you know, you can imagine what our ancestors went through, because even right now, it's hard to explain our reality and what's happening, right? People talk about January 6th, the pandemic. It's hard to explain reality. Can you imagine 1868, 1869, 1870? This is right before they signed the Klan Act, right? They were killing us by the hundreds and thousands. In South Carolina, in Florida, in Alabama, in Mississippi. And these are the high points of positive Reconstruction, where, you know, when Thomas Miller 20 years later is saying we were 8 years in power, and Ta-Nehisi Coates titles that, you know, his book that's 1868 to 1876. So can you imagine all these things they were calling outrages were racist pogroms against Black people? Way before Tulsa, there's Memphis in 1866. There's New Orleans in 1866. There's Hamburg, right? South Carolina, Mississippi. There are all these outrages where Black people are being slaughtered. And that's part of the history alongside of Black people creating schools and churches and buying land and farm cooperatives, right? As early as 1861, 1862, you think about the South Carolina Seacoast Islands. We were there, Port Royal and other places, right? There were all these experiments that folks are only beginning way before William Sherman said 40 acres, right? We were doing our thing, and it was violently repudiated, especially in the hinterlands where there was much less of an opportunity to organize militias, pro-Black militias, Black self-defense groups and organizing, right? So that's a story that people still don't know, but you can imagine even in our own time with all this social media, it's very, very hard to explain and get a hold on reality, right? So you can imagine what they went through trying to make 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment count and to protect themselves and to defend their lives. And even at times when they allied with white people like Wilmington, North Carolina, you had thousands of militia all throughout North Carolina, including Benjamin Tillman's red shirts, who came and slaughtered people and staged a successful coup in Wilmington, North Carolina. Wilmington is still like under 10% Black now. We were like 40% of Wilmington, 50% of Wilmington. Mm-hmm. So we lost all that land. We lost our lives. We lost our any shred of citizenship. You retain dignity, but not in a way that you can exemplify publicly, right? So these are all stories that people don't want shared and will call critical race theory. But these are our stories, our narratives, right? And it connects with comic books in the sense that if you can create comic books in a world where there's an understanding of that story, the story comes out much, much differently, right? And you're not creating this world where, somehow there's racial equality, right? This world where you don't have to talk about this, or a world where somehow there's gender equality, or a world where there's no, queer phobia, transphobia. So it's really important, these stories that we tell.
Yes, and
I was going to say, because I've realized I didn't. I studied attitudes, persuasion, prejudice, and stereotyping, and the class I'm teaching right now is an intergroup relations, prejudice, and stereotyping class. And one of the things I've thought about is getting them to read or telling them about truth, the red, white, and black, which is the Isaiah Bradley story.
Yeah, which is that's a brilliant
being
novel.
From Oklahoma, when Watchmen came out, I had so many people asking me, "Is that real?" And my oldest brother is a retired history professor, and he was actually on he's been working with the group and been on the commission for now about close to 30 years on trying to get the word out about Tulsa. But yeah, you're right that so many people, they either don't want to hear the stories or they want to shift the stories to be, well, it's much better now.
Yeah.
Yes.
And ignore the history, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Go ahead, Dr. Griffin.
You sure?
Yep.
Elijah? Okay. I was going to say that, Dr. Joseph, you said that violent repudiation, that's the phrase that you used. And I just want to underscore that is part and parcel of white supremacy. And when we understand white supremacy as the organizing structure, definitely in the West, but also, of course, it's been globalized throughout the world. When we start to understand violent repudiation and we start to expand what that violence can look like and what it can sound like, then we can understand the Tea Party movement, the Trump administration, January 6th. We can understand all of those historical events as being intentional, as being orchestrated, and as being calibrated, right, as a correction of sorts to not linear progress that people of color have made, but a great deal of progress in a number of different areas of society. And it's not to say that that progress has even remotely been enough, but it is to say that the structure will respond in ways to preserve itself. And the people who benefit from the structure, and in this context, I'm talking about white people. Now, to be clear, right, of course, we know that not all white people benefit equally from the structures of white supremacy and racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy. But what we do know is that the far right, and I mean the far right, I'm not talking about Republicans, I'm not talking about conservatives. They can be part of the far right, but they don't have to be part of the far right. But the far right has been able to appropriate a narrative of victimhood that makes it seem as though these orchestrated responses, this violent repudiation, is something that is necessary, is something that benefits the masses.
Yeah.
And it's so incredibly important to underscore that in this moment where we look out into the world and not not a lot makes sense to a lot of everyday people, right? Whether it is my students in my undergrad class who are really surprised by the nature of explicit racism in this moment, to my colleagues who can't believe that our Black Cultural Center got a bomb threat on the second day of the semester. Elijah, I'm thinking about you right now. The ethos of surprise, the ethos of shock, the ethos of disbelief, to me, that is produced and reproduced via the stories that we don't tell, right? And I am so incredibly disturbed by how many people are incredibly disturbed by where we are in this moment. Because where we are in this moment, I find incredibly disheartening, but I do not find it surprising.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that the thing I connected to is that this has been happening, over all three periods of Reconstruction. So in a lot of ways, the story has been consistent for the mainstream. I think with Black folks, whether you're thinking about George Washington Carver or Carter G. Woodson, Black club women's movement, just so many different ways we've told ourselves a different story, Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And certainly all the way through the 1619 Project, BLM, Black Power, Black Arts, that's telling a different story. And on some levels, I think the efforts to ban Black history show you a kind of progress in the sense that 2020 and the racial and political reckoning made millions of white people and school districts try to take another look and say what's going on, and we want to know about this history, right? And so the sort of creation of CRT as a boogie object is really connected to sort of this amplification of the lost cause during the third Reconstruction. You can call it lost cause 3.0, because there is a 2.0 with Strom Thurmond and George Wallace and even Barry Goldwater, and 3.0 is obviously Trump and other folks, DeSantis, other folks who are right there, right? Podcasters, right? And in certain ways, I'd say, Dr. Griffin, that far right really has become large aspects of mainstream GOP politics. It has. I mean, I think that's unfortunate, but I think to not identify that is a big problem, and I think that obviously people can suffer consequences for identifying that, but that's, by the time recently people are saying January 6th was just regular discourse, that's what the GOP is saying. And if, we've got the footage and people were traumatized, people were violent, folks were saying they were going to cut people's heads off as they stormed the Capitol and defiled the Capitol with the Confederate flag and anti-Semitic, symbols. I mean, we're in trouble, and you're going to definitely be in trouble where this system was not designed to have two parties and one party be just anti-democratic authoritarian system. And that happened during Reconstruction too. And that's how Reconstruction failed, because the other party, in this case, the Republican Party, didn't have enough of a wholesale commitment to Black humanity and Black dignity and Black citizenship to engage in a fight. I mean, Frederick Douglass says it best. Frederick Douglass said, war between the whites brought us emancipation. That's what he said. He said, war between the whites brought us emancipation. And then as the 1870s are progressing, he says, now what will peace between the whites bring? He said, what will peace bring, right? And what it brought was, whole scale, racial terror. It brought, and it's interesting that when we think about Watchmen, and Dr. White is from Oklahoma, that they take that story of racial terror in the early 20th century and fashion it within this comic book world and produce something really rich and really evocative, something we had never seen before. And it made sense because Cord Jefferson, you had Regina King, you had Black folks in the writer's room, right? Thinking about this. And so in a lot of ways, they queered the whole story, both queered in aspects of sexuality, but queer in its big panoramic meaning too, right? So in that way, you always want to queer the status quo, right? Because you want to show a different, and that's what historically at our best, the Black tradition, the Black freedom struggle sort of queers that status quo and says, well, wait a minute, let's think about this and let's uplift these folks. And I think that's the best aspect of BLM has been centering, obviously, Black women and Black feminist organizing, but folks who are disabled and folks who are poor and folks who are HIV positive, and saying that, all Black lives have to matter, and we haven't always done that. We haven't always done that. We have stuff within our own social movement traditions that we should be ashamed of. And we have a lot to be proud of, but we have stuff to be ashamed of as well, right? And so we've mistreated each other because we haven't thought of Black people who might have been different from us in some aspect or facet as one of us and as our family. And as if this person is harmed, I'm harmed too. And I think that the best aspect of, and the work of Beth Ritchie, Kathy Cohen, but Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, so many different people, Ruthie Gilmore, obviously Angela Davis, and now Keisha Blaine and so many others really attest to this. But we have to stand in solidarity with one another. We can't have any kind of cleavages and say, that Black person over there is not worth it. You know what I mean? It's like,
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Dr. Lawrence,
yeah.
Dr. Lawrence, did you have a point on that? Sorry.
Well, I was thinking about Dr. Griffin's comment and essentially about this element of people being so disturbed and distressed by our current moment or by the atrocities. And so I think that it's just important to note that shock and surprise is also privilege. When you are not confronted with these stories that Dr. Joseph has demonstrated that we need to tell, then you don't have to think about the things that Blacks and other people of color are facing every day. And therefore that becomes part of your privilege. And so for me, I get very frustrated, particularly in the aftermath of the murder of Mr. George Floyd. Yeah. I kept hearing people say, oh, I'm so surprised. And I said, well, in 2020, why are you so surprised? And I spotted on slavery. And I said, because we've been trying to tell you for 155 years. What are you surprised about? If you had listened to Brother Kaepernick just a few years ago, then maybe we wouldn't be here. So I just think that it's also important to note that surprise is a part of privilege. And I think that people need to own that and think about that as we continue this struggle about the kinds of stories that we're going to tell vis-a-vis the history books that people are banning right now, or the use of critical race theory, or even in terms of comic books, because all of these things intersect so perfectly, and the comic books provide us with something very significant that we rarely get as historically marginalized populations. And so I don't want to take up too much space here, but I think that the value of those comics, it's no surprise then that, Black Panther comes out in '66 and then gets its own treatment in '68, that Luke Cage is conceived of in 1972 when blaxploitation cinema is everything, right? Yeah. And what those films do, for better or worse, I'm not saying blaxploitation is better than anything else, but what those films do is they provide us with catharsis, right? That in terms of blaxploitation, films made between 1970 and 1975 by both Black and white filmmakers alike, in order to capitalize on the Black film-going audience, is that you had
predominantly white, because it really started
white,
when we started. It's really Melvin Van Peebles' Sweetback's Badass Song, and then Shaft, Gordon Parks, and then Gordon Parks.
It's actually Ossie Davis and Cotton Comes to Harlem.
Yeah, but I don't think of that as blaxploitation.
Oh, yes,
I don't.
Yes.
No, I don't think about that or the sequel as blaxploitation.
Oh,
I actually think of those as films by Black creators, because at that point you can go to Gordon Parks and The Learning Tree.
No.
You know what I'm saying? So Cotton Comes to Harlem is just the best adaptation of a Chester Himes novel ever.
Absolutely.
And it's Ossie Davis sort of taking, because who does the same thing is Sidney Poitier takes over as director for Buck and the Preacher with Harry Belafonte.
Absolutely.
The same period. So I would just definitely, I'd say that's a soulful film, but I'm not going to put that in black exploitation.
Oh, I do.
Because I would say that when we think about the start of it, it's an independence from Melvin Van Peebles, and then Shaft saves MGM by grossing $11 million
from going bankrupt.
Superfly is Gordon Parks Jr. in 72,
Superfly.
and then you get all these white producers and writers who just hire, because one of the exceptions is going to be when we think about Thomasine and Bushrod, right?
Yeah,
when we
and
think
Blackula
who just died. Yeah, you know, Vanetta McGee, right? You know, so it's going to be those are going to be some of the exceptions, but I think that Cotton Comes to Harlem is not.
Oh no, yes, I'm sorry, I have to say
it's not black exploitation because
we can continue this.
Yes.
But I would say that it is because what happens is the characteristics that come to define black exploitation are embodied by both Cotton Comes to Harlem and then Van Peebles' independent film, Sweet Sweetback Badass Song.
Well, I'd say that people then utilize these two really great independent artistic films to produce something else. I wouldn't disagree with that.
Cotton Comes to Harlem is United Artists. Yeah, it's not independent.
So, well, I mean, it's Ozzie Davis, though. I mean, he's a black director, so I'm giving him that credit, that little street cred.
So we can debate the merits of this. So anyway, my point about those films is that they provided catharsis because you had these larger than life black characters who were overcoming metaphorically the system.
Oh, absolutely.
By white villains, right?
Absolutely.
And so then we see the same thing happening in some ways with a Black Panther, with a Blade. They give us the opportunity or the catharsis to overcome, to exist in ways in which we are indestructible. Hence my thing about Luke Cage and the Marvel series. You know,
especially Luke Cage or BLM.
And the films are very much about that release because as one of my colleagues, Amy Ongiri, said, think about how you don't feel like you can react, and that the people stood there and watched Mr. Floyd as he was murdered.
Yeah.
Right. What these movies give us the impression, or they let us think we can fight back.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons those narratives are so powerful. So.
And I like that. No. And Dr. Griffin, I'm going to get to you. I want to ask this question though largely, and it actually is a great transition point. As far as in Dr. Joseph, you talked about Afrofuturism, in the third reconstruction, but to you all, and maybe Dr. Griffin, if you would like to start, why is it important to have Black creators working behind the camera in superhero stories, from showrunners to writers to directors? And is it part of this third, wave of reconstruction, essentially?
I can. Malijah, do you want me to talk about that, or Dr. Joseph, do you want to chime in?
You know, very, very quickly, I think that the Black creatives are hugely important because representation matters in terms of the supply chain of the creative process. So we have not been represented as writers, as grips, a part of SAG, Screen Actors, Directors Guild, Producers Guild, lighting, just the whole supply chain, right? And when we are in the room, different creative questions and thoughts happen and appear. So you think about people like Gina and Reggie Bythewood, right? And the great work they've done, not just in Love and Basketball, but Beyond the Lights, and now they're doing all these different series and movies. And so, I think it's pivotal. It's pivotal for us to get Black women and men behind the scenes in every strata of the creative process. And I think during 2020, we saw how few are connected to film and television, but both the majors, but also off Broadway, the poetry foundations, art museums. We are the biggest creatives that the country has ever had. And we are, our creativity is constantly exploited. It's constantly exploited. The profits are enjoyed by other people, and we are marginalized from even the supply chains that lead to even when we do appear on screen, right? And so I thought that this past couple of years, more and more people are talking about it. Some people are doing stuff about it. Michael B. Jordan. We think about Frances, I'm losing her name, who McDormand, who talked about getting diversity behind the scenes and having a framework and saying, look, we got to be at 12%, 13%. We got to be connected to this and all the vendors and everything. And I think we should be doing the same thing in higher ed. We should be doing the same thing in higher ed and asking those questions. So I think it's hugely important. We need Black creatives. I think Issa Rae is a great example of this, and the way the brother Larry helped her, Wilmore helped her and get the HBO deal, and elevating each other. In this case, he elevated a Black woman. We've got to elevate each other and not feel in competition with each other.
Love that. Dr. Griffin, you had a comment?
There's a book written by Eitan in 2008, and it's called In the Search of the Black Fantastic. And
oh yeah,
I raised the concept of the Black Fantastic because what it does is it centers the complicated pliability of Blackness in relation to the dominant narratives that we tell through the logics of modernity, right? Those logics being the ones that both institutionalize and sustain white supremacy. So Eitan's concept, the reason that, and I'll get there, Malaysia, I promise I'll get to the presence of Black folks throughout the industry. The Black Fantastic, it reminds us that progress is not linear, it is not fixed, and it is not impermeable. Despite, what I love about the conversation tonight is that everybody in the audience, myself included, we got this long list of all of these key moments in Black representation, all of which are very worthy of celebration and pride and of course, remembrance. But one of the things that we have to remember is that progress is not linear. That is the story that we're told. That's not the reality that we live in. And so a great deal of my own research deconstructing representations of Blackness has grappled with the representational strategies of whiteness. And I get so upset about it, right? Because you've got to grapple with whiteness to really make a full argument and to more fully deconstruct the stories that are oftentimes told about Black people. Here, of course, realizing that white people don't have to be part of the story or visible on screen for the white imagination to constrain who we envision Black people being or becoming, right? And so there's a laundry list of critical media studies scholars for those in the audience who write about the representational strategies of whiteness, right? It's casting white saviors, it's fostering empathy for racists, it's forgiving white passivity in response to racism and anti-Black racism. It's minimalizing racism as trivial. It's promoting racelessness, colorblindness, post-racialism, whatever it is that makes white people and white audiences spending their money on media feel better about the stories being told. Here's my concern, right? Definitely when it comes to Marvel, and also definitely when it comes to Black Panther and having a Black Captain America, is that another aspect of representational strategies of whiteness is scripting characters of color to convey, to sanction, to fortify whiteness in the stories that white people and white structures prefer to be told, right? And so the question I arrived to is, in what context, and here I'm thinking about Captain America, but really any character of color, in what context is a Black male character a better cinematic vehicle for neocolonial whiteness than a white male character, right? I would argue that in the context of white supremacy, a character of color is actually the better vehicle if we want to place ourselves in this neoliberal moment of progress where the instances of racism and white supremacy that are happening are just instances. We're just having a hard time in this moment instead of a continuation of historical degradation. And I point back, Malaysia, to your question about the representation of people of color in the industry, because I think that is one of the core spaces for a politics of intervention to happen. It can't just be, you know, the token Black person in this position or that position. We need Black people involved at every level of Black storytelling and media making, whether it's as directors or auteurs or cast directors or, folks who are in the editing room. We need that presence, that lived subjective experience, that body that carries our histories in myriad different ways. Black people are not monolithic, right? That's one of the reasons that we need so much Black diversity involved in telling these stories, so that they can't be soaked up in the sponge of white supremacy.
Dr. Griffin, you made me think about One Night in Miami versus Judas and the Black Messiah. So, and I wrote about both of these films, and I think One Night in Miami is brilliant and a masterpiece. But the reason why, didn't win the Oscars and Judas and the Black Messiah did is precisely because what you're talking about. I would complicate Captain America. I kind of think that it's in what you're talking about, but it also subverts it. But I think that Judas and the Black Messiah and One Night in Miami, Judas and the Black Messiah absolutely does different savior complexes, white guides through the safari of the Black community. You never get an understanding of Fred Hampton from that film. You never get an understanding of the Black Panthers from that film. And again, Ryan Coogler produced that and Shaka King directed it, but they did it in a way where you can say, look, we're going to have the white Herbert J. Edgar Hoover. We're going to have the white agent, Jesse Plemons. And so the audience never, ever gets to understand the Black Panthers. They never get to understand post-war Chicago and white supremacy in Chicago. They never get to understand what animates the brilliance of Fred Hampton. And they never get to really see the mendacity of the US government and the murder of Fred Hampton. And the film won an Oscar, okay? Whereas when you think about One Night in Miami is straight, no chaser. There are no white saviors or guides for you in One Night in Miami. You are a fly on the wall. Jim Brown, Malcolm X, Sam Cooke, Muhammad Ali, all brilliantly played, especially Malcolm X by Kingsley Ben Amis. And what you get there is this different version of Black masculinity that subverts the whole of the stereotype. So the Oscar folks couldn't handle it, because if you had done that screenplay and had a white guy character who's recording it, or a young woman who's a journalist who's allowed to stay in a room with them, they would have loved that. You put the young Reese Witherspoon in there with those 4 Black guys. They're like, yeah, I get it, right? I get it.
Yes.
It's Reese who humanized them. Meeting up with Reese turned them from savages to citizens, right?
Absolutely.
But they were always citizens. The savage is just in that mind's eye, right? So it's a great example of what you're talking about in that context.
No, absolutely, absolutely. We're running out of time. I'm just gonna say this. But I want to end with Dr. White. Bring us on home, as we had from the jump. Bring us on home. What are your thoughts on this conversations? And then we can kind of end it off on here.
Well, one of the things I was thinking, I'm loving this discussion, because I thought about having people in the room and why it's important. I think back to Amistad with Steven Spielberg, which I actually thought was a decent film, not a great film.
Or Lincoln Spielberg. No Frederick Douglass. Lincoln met Frederick Douglass 3 times during the war. I met Tony Kushner at Harvard and told him, I said, Tony, baby, he met him 3 times. Why is there no Frederick Douglass? He's like, That was the screenwriter of Lincoln. I said, where's Frederick Douglass? He meets him 3 times. You're telling me this white Lincoln just humanizes Black people on his own? Lincoln wanted to colonize us as late as 1863. Frederick Douglass saves the nation. Why don't you admit it? What's the matter?
Yeah, no, I agree. And as someone who grew up in Kentucky, that's part of it. Talk about shock, and where you tell people, it's like, I just told my class today, it's like, did Abraham Lincoln free all the enslaved? And some of the students knew already, like, no, I'm not going to say yes because it's our setup. But one of the things I thought with that movie, I remember they talked about behind the scenes of putting the Black actors in manacles. in shackles. And they said that Steven Spielberg himself said, looking at it and seeing white people literally putting Black people in shackles, he's like, oh, we can't. And that's why I think if you're not in the room, if someone in the room would have said, wait, you cannot do this. You cannot have white people going around as the crew, putting Black people in these, chaining them down. And that's what I think about. For one of the things for Black Panther in that movie, what I loved Ruth Carter's, the costuming was just, and if people want to do a deep dive into why each costume had significance. There was meaning behind it. But from the very beginning, it's, can you tell me a story? And at the very end, when the young Black man is looking up T'Challa in Oakland, and he goes, who are you? And he just gives this little wry smile. And I thought, that's it. It's the story, the diversity, the differences and the journeys of African-American, of Africans, of all the different groups. In African-American culture and in Black culture, telling that story, knowing your story, knowing, with my grandparents always saying, I know your people, those kind of things, that does not happen if we're not in the room.
Exactly.
That screenplay would have been completely different. And that's why we need to be there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. White. And with that, we are a little over time. And so I just want to thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. I actually learned a lot, very much so. And I know we have some questions in the chat. What I would like to do is those questions, if we can write them in an email and then see if you all can answer them, and then we can give those back to those folks. So please, if you can, those that are in the chat, if you did write a question, please put your email address in the chat, and we will be gladly to see if we can reply back to that. The kind of themes that we talked about today was inclusive narratives. We talked about radical Black dignity. We talked about the myth of a better reality, racial optimism. We talked about Afrofuturism. We talked about City Portier. We talked about the third wave of reconstruction. We talked about several things. And so I just thank you all. Thank you all to the panelists. Thank you, Dr. Joseph, Dr. Lawrence, Dr. White, Dr. Griffin, really for bringing us in this conversation and talking about representation. I think it boils down to representation in the media, representation in comic books, in our medium, one of our favorite mediums that we're all kind of fond of here in this conversation tonight. And so I thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Osteen.
Thank you so much, Elijah. Yeah, we should compare notes, because I got like 2 pads of notes here that I'm going to have to email and say, can you remind me who that author is so I can look that up. Let me share, both my personal gratitude and that on behalf of the college and the university, to Dr. Griffin, to Dr. Joseph, to Dr. White, Dr. Lawrence, and Mr. Garfield for your scholarship, for your passion, for taking the time out of your busy lives to come here and educate us and challenge us and sort of expand our understanding. And even though nobody asked me, I'm going to say that my favorite comic book character was Eartha Kitt as Catwoman. Not only because what she represented as a Black woman, but she was a powerful woman. She was a woman who was allowed to have sexuality and keep her ground. And, I feel very, very sorry for Halle Berry and that terrible script that did not allow her to be another Catwoman. That was very sad. Anyway, we'll move on from that. So to all the visitors and participants today, thank you for joining us. Please know that we appreciate your continued support for our Student Emergency Fund through our past events. Again, a very special thank you to Charlie Pohl, who made this event possible. We are already beginning our planning for next year's Beeley Lecture, and it would be wonderful if we could get together in person and have some congregation around that. That would be really special, so fingers crossed for that. We do have our upcoming grand challenges for social work event on March 2nd and our social work beyond the classroom research presentation on March 22nd. You can find more information about that on our college event page. And so I have a quote to leave you with, which is from King T'Challa's sister Shuri. It's not the quote that I would use, but this is a good one. So just because something works doesn't mean it can't be improved. And I will say my script writer is like, don't go off script. One of the most telling, funny, tragic, moving quotes of hers is about the colonizer in the room. And I think, I don't know if I don't know that all the white people in the theater with me got it. I got it because I was a social worker, but the entire, group of Black people who were watching it laughed as hard as they could. And I just think it was such a beautiful moment in that film that probably people didn't even realize that they were being challenged to think about that. So again, we're so grateful for your time and expertise. And I hope that you all have a good evening, and I hope that you are well. And I hope to see our paths cross again one day. That would be wonderful. My very best.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's a great conversation. I learned so much. Thank you.
All right.